I want to begin by speaking about the fundamental paradox of the Caribbean. There's something very paradoxical about our Caribbean region. On the one hand, our region was founded in the most extreme forms of violence, warfare, genocide, criminality, terrorism. We go back to the end of the 15th century. In a couple days' time, we will be marking the 12th of October, the day on which Columbus stumbled into the Caribbean in 1492 and immediately began engineering a process of genocide of the indigenous people. And that was only a prelude to the centuries of enslavement of the people of Africa. It was terrorism against the indigenous people, terrorism against the African people, but it was also incessant warfare. The Caribbean was known as the cockpit of Europe. It was in the Caribbean that European nations fought their wars. In fact, there was a phrase, a well-known phrase in the 16th century, a phrase that said, "No peace beyond the line." And in fact, the European nations actually enshrined in the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, a treaty that was entered into in 1559 between France and Spain, in which they said, and I quote, and they're talking about the Caribbean, "West of the prime meridian and south of the Tropic of Cancer, violence by either party to the other side shall not be regarded as a contravention of the treaties." So in other words, even when they came together in Europe to negotiate peace in Europe, they said, "Don't mind, we have negotiated these peace treaties for Europe. That is only for Europe. In the Caribbean, we are at liberty to commit whatever violence we like, and it will not be considered a breach of the treaty." So the Caribbean was the scene for European warfare, and they fought Spain, England, France, Holland, Denmark, the German state of Brandenburg, Prussia, Sweden. They fought each other over these Caribbean territories. In fact, in the 18th century, the Anglo-French wars were largely fought. The wars between Britain and France were largely fought in the Caribbean. So this has been the fate of the Caribbean. The wars of the European powers against the Kalinago people, the institutional violence of slavery and the oppression of our people, forcing our people to resist with slave rebellions, the century and more of American imperialism in the Caribbean, the invasions of Cuba, of Puerto Rico, of Haiti, of Panama, of the Dominican Republic. If we look at the whole history, it is a history of everything except peace, a history of war and terrorism. But you know what is paradoxical? In the midst of all of that violence, that organized violence and mayhem, the nations of the Caribbean, the independent nations of the Caribbean, have never fought a war against each other. All of the wars were impositions from European and North American powers. Jamaica never fought a war against Trinidad and Tobago. Barbados never fought a war against Guyana or St. Lucia. Cuba has never attacked any Caribbean nation. We have never engaged in warfare in a region that is a Caribbean region that is synonymous with warfare and violence. The autonomous people of the Caribbean have never carried out warfare against each other. And so I say that there is something special about the Caribbean people. I make the claim that because of our peculiar history, the oppression that was inflicted upon us, the fact that our whole history is about resisting exploitation, terrorism, oppression, trying to resist it and transcend it, that we Caribbean people have a very special vocation in this world, to speak for peace, to speak for moral principles. And I address this in a book that I wrote a couple of years ago called Reasonings with the Youth. And this is what I said in a chapter called The Emperor is Naked. I said, somebody, some small and morally clear-sighted nation has to tell the emperor that he is naked and that his actions are a perversion and a repudiation of international law and of the sacred principles of justice and morality. And so, acting on behalf of and in the name of the people of Barbados, we say, let little Barbados accept this challenge of speaking truth to the powerful, pompous-setting, morally deluded United States of America. You see, the citizen of Barbados is the citizen of a country whose government has never invaded any other country, never bombed any foreign city, never carried out any political assassination, nor ever committed any other crime against humanity. Many of us in Barbados often wonder what it must feel like to be the citizen of a country whose government routinely murders and exterminates other human beings in one's name. What, we wonder, does it feel like to be the citizen of a nation that exterminated 3 million Vietnamese, that dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that wiped out hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, that has carried out scores of illegal foreign invasions, and that has assassinated foreign leaders ranging from Africa's Patrice Lumumba to Latin America's Salvador Allende. How is the average American citizen able to live with the consciousness that such acts of barbarity are routinely committed in his or her name? End of quote. And I use Barbados, but I could just as easily have said Jamaica, or Cuba, or Trinidad and Tobago, or Guyana, or any of the other Caribbean nations whose records are the same. The Caribbean, because of our peculiar history, must be a zone of peace. It must be our aspiration to be a beacon of peace in this world. And that concept, we have to give credit. We have to give credit to the Caribbean leader who most articulated that concept. And that Caribbean leader was none other than the late Maurice Bishop of Grenada. It was Maurice Bishop who most insisted that the Caribbean must be a zone of peace. And although Maurice launched the idea, I think it is true to say that the idea has suffered from not being concretized, not given. It has remained for too long an abstraction. But in January of 2014, at the summit of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States that was held in Havana, Cuba, the 28th and 29th of January 2014, the leaders of CELAC, our Community of Latin America and the Caribbean, issued a very important declaration, the Havana Declaration, that began to give concrete meaning to that phrase, zone of peace. And I want to just bring to your attention some of the principles and goals that our CELAC leaders have set before us. They have said to us that we must create a zone of peace in the Caribbean, and in order to do so, these are the principles and goals that we must pursue. Number one, respect and uphold the inalienable right of every state to choose its own political, economic, social, and cultural system. In other words, respect the right of self-determination. And this right of self-determination is at the heart of the illegal campaign that the United States of America is now waging against Venezuela and has been waging against Cuba for some 60 years now. As part of our concept of a zone of peace, we insist that every sovereign nation has the right to determine for itself, in consonance with the wishes of its own people, what type of political, economic, social, cultural system it intends to pursue. So if Venezuela says that its system is 21st century socialism, who is Donald Trump or other members of the US establishment to say to Venezuela that you are wrong, and if we have to destroy your country or invade you, we are determined that you must abandon the system that you have determined is correct for you. So we have to stand for that principle. Our leaders have also told us that there must be a commitment not to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. And some of us have been fighting that battle over the last 2 years in the Organization of American States. No intervention in the legitimate internal affairs of the countries of the Caribbean. Thirdly, the Havana Declaration says that we must be committed to resolve disputes peacefully through dialogue and negotiation or other forms of peaceful settlement established in international law. Number 4, our Havana Declaration commits us to the principle of global nuclear disarmament. And specifically, we are committed to uphold the 1967 Tellico Treaty, which established our region of Latin America and the Caribbean as a nuclear-free zone. And, you know, as Hope indicated, and our brother from Guyana has indicated, the world is now in an era of nuclear threat, with Mr. Trump threatening to totally destroy North Korea, threatening that the world will see fire and fury in North Korea on a scale never seen before in world history. We, the people of the Caribbean, we who have no aspiration to develop our own nuclear weapons, we must stand for a nuclear-free world. We must insist on nuclear disarmament. And we must target the country that is the nuclear power that is closest to us and that has by far the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, the United States of America. It is really amazing that the United States of America arrogates to itself the right to possess nuclear weapons, to determine which other countries may possess as well and which other countries may not possess. And yet the United States of America is the only country in the world that has ever used nuclear or atomic weapons on other human beings. In 1945, when they bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we are saying that we, the people of the Caribbean, we must be in the vanguard of demanding a nuclear-free world, of demanding universal disarmament. And we must send a very clear message to the USA. You are right on our borders with the largest, most menacing nuclear armament right on our borders, and we consider that unacceptable. Number 5, our leaders have said that there must be a commitment to pursue peace by undertaking agricultural development in our region and striving for and achieving food security of the Caribbean. So, zone of peace, while we focus on those heavy matters of warfare and nuclear warfare, but we also understand peace as extending to putting social systems in place to secure the health and well-being of our people. We understand that just as the violence that comes from the barrel of a gun damages human beings, that the violence that comes from poverty, the violence that comes from lack of education, the violence that comes from lack of nutrition also damages human beings. And so they have conceptualized the pursuit of peace as also the pursuit of the nutrition and the food security of our people. They also commit to pursue peace by striving for and achieving the literacy and education of the Caribbean people. They have committed to pursue peace by striving for the achievement of universal public health services to the Caribbean people. And as I said, that's a legitimate conceptualization of peace. How do we protect our people from the damage that is wrought to their lives by the lack of healthcare facilities, for example? And finally, they said that we must commit to the promotion of a culture of peace in the Caribbean based on the principles of the United Nations Declaration on a Culture of Peace. And I would like to end on that note of the promotion of a culture of peace, because that is the concept that we have to further flesh out now. What does it mean to promote a culture of peace? I think if we're talking about the Caribbean, the logical place to start in envisaging what a culture of peace means, the logical place to start is to recognize and acknowledge those genocides that are at the very foundation of Caribbean history. It is critical. We can't talk about fostering a culture of peace if we do not recognize and acknowledge the genocide committed against the indigenous native people of the Caribbean, if we do not acknowledge and recognize the centuries of genocide committed against the enslaved African people, and if we do not demand reparations. So reparations, an acknowledgement of those genocides, and the building of a campaign for reparations is critical to any culture of peace that makes sense in the Caribbean. For by doing so, by insisting upon reparations, we send a message. There will be no impunity for those who commit crimes against humanity. You commit those crimes, you committed genocide in the 15th century against the native people of the Caribbean. You thought you had gotten away with it, that you were not going to be called to account. Well, 500 years later, we are saying there is no impunity. You are being called to the bar of justice. You are being called to account for those crimes, even if they were committed 500 years ago. That's the importance of the reparations movement. It sends a message. There is no impunity for criminality. It also sends a message that we validate the intrinsic and precious humanity of our Native American ancestors and of our African ancestors. Because if we permit those kinds of horrendous crimes to be committed against our ancestors, and we do not demand accountability and justice, it means that we are saying to the world that we accept that our ancestors were less than sacred beings entitled to respect and justice. And so the fostering, our leaders have said to us that we must promote a culture of peace, and we say it has to start with acknowledging those genocides and pursuing a program of reparations. Fostering a culture of peace. All of our Caribbean countries, we have to ask ourselves, the value system that we are pursuing now, is that value system consonant with a culture of peace? We were warned. Our great Caribbean scholar and historian Gordon Lewis, Professor Gordon Lewis, warned the Caribbean back in the 1960s when he wrote that book, The Growth of the Modern West Indies. He said, look, you are now embarking upon independence. You have a very important decision to make. Already enmeshed in your colonial culture are social deformities that were created by colonialism, that lend themselves towards social inequality, that lend themselves towards attitudes of violence and so forth. The newly independent countries of the Caribbean have a choice to make. Do you choose to place yourself under the sway of the cultural and material imperialism of capitalist North America, or do you seek another path? And he said, be careful about the choice you make, because have a look at Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was the Caribbean country that was placed under the sway of American cultural and material imperialism from way back. at the beginning of the 20th century. He said, look at Puerto Rico. Look at what has been the fate of Puerto Rico. Look at the crime. Look at the violence. Look at the incest. Look at the drug addiction. Look at the social disarray in the society. He said to us, be careful. Puerto Rico is an example of where you will end up if you adopt that value system. Unfortunately, many of our leaders did not heed the wise words of Professor Gordon Lewis. And today in the Caribbean, we are all bemoaning the gun culture, the violent crimes, the young people shooting each other, the lack of human empathy, the increasing social inequality, a system of social winners and losers, the trivializing of human life. So I'm saying our leaders have said to us to foster a culture of peace. It means we have to seriously rethink our predominant value system. We have to seriously rethink the values that we are imparting to our young people through all those the movies that we watch, the social media, the television programs, the models of success that we are holding up before them. Culture of peace. And so in thinking of the Caribbean as a zone of peace, those are issues that we have to grapple with. We have to say all foreign military bases out of the Caribbean. That's a given. We have to say with our brother from Martinique that a zone of peace cannot accommodate European colonies. If the Caribbean is to be a zone of peace, it must be a colonial-free zone, because intrinsic to colonialism is exploitation, is domination, cultural domination, psychological domination, anything but peace. So we, as part of our campaign for a zone of peace in the Caribbean, we have to support the anti-colonial struggles of our brothers in Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guyana, and wherever there are colonies in the Caribbean. And I want to end by bringing to your attention that our late brother Tim Hector, addressing the Sao Paulo Forum, I think in the year 2001, he made a call that the Caribbean be declared a zone of peace by vote of the United Nations Security Council and United Nations General Assembly. In other words, what Tim Hector was saying is that because of the peculiar experience of the Caribbean, because of the need for the Caribbean region to be held up before the world as a unique zone of peace, that should be validated at the highest levels of international law and diplomacy. That we should actually call upon the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly of United Nations by resolution to declare and affirm the Caribbean as a zone of peace. Of course, if that is done, it means that, well, if you're a zone of peace, a foreign power like the United States, for example, but there are other foreign powers as well, are not entitled to use the territory of the Caribbean to be attacking sister countries. And this is something that we in Barbados have to take seriously. We have a massive American embassy there in Wilde, massive. And we have to ask ourselves, what actually goes on within the precincts of that fortress-like embassy? Is that fortress-like structure simply for processing visa applications? Might it be that the territory of Barbados is being used as a location for intelligence gathering and other military and intelligence activities that are detrimental to sister Caribbean nations like the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela or like the Republic of Cuba? And what about that facility at the District A police complex that is so shrouded in mystery and security? The Barbadian people, we need to start asking these questions. Is our sovereign, independent nation being used for military and intelligence activities that are detrimental to sister Caribbean countries? Of course, if the Caribbean is designated a zone of peace, it means that those kinds of activities are totally off limits. We have to ask, are our news media being used as a conduit of propaganda for aggressive wars and attacks, illegal attacks against sovereign nations such as Venezuela and Cuba? These are serious questions if we're talking about a zone of peace. And we in Barbados especially, perhaps of all the Caribbean people, because we have seen firsthand the damage and evil of terrorism when on the 6th of October, 41 years to this very day, the 6th of October, 1976, they bombed a civilian Cubana airline in the airspace of Barbados, killing all 76 people on board. And we have launched a campaign to have the 6th of October declared by the United Nations the International Day Against Terrorism. That too is a part of a component of a campaign to establish the Caribbean as a zone of peace. And this afternoon, when we finish this conference here, we are going to be going to the monument in Paynes Bay, and everybody is invited. We're going to make our way to Paynes Bay at 4:30 to lay wreaths, to pay respect to all those who perished as martyrs in 1976. And we must make the tragedy that engulfed them, we must make it meaningful in terms of our effort to establish the Caribbean as a zone of peace, our effort to transform the Caribbean into great advocates for peace all over this world. So, brothers and sisters, essentially, that is what this conference is all about. It is about us coming together, putting our heads together to give concrete shape and meaning to this aspiration that the Caribbean be a zone of peace, and then to go beyond that, to concretize a pan-Caribbean peace movement whose job it will be to make that aspiration a reality. I thank you very much.